Namaste and welcome, dear friends. This is another wonderful episode of Cosmic Conversations, a space and time where we gather to explore the most profound ideas in consciousness. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is our first interview that's actually physically happening. Usually I'm on Zoom with people, so this is a first, and I'm so excited. So today I am here with my beloved Gabriel. Gabriel is a sadhu. He's a yogi. He has experienced a profound vision in consciousness, and he's been sharing his stories for the past few weeks as we've gotten to know each other with all of our friends. And I thought, gosh, it would be wonderful if I could interview him to share, to create a space where these teachings can come forth into the wider world. So thank you so much for tuning in, and let's just dive in. So we're going to talk today about Gabriel's time in spiritual solitude and his leaving society and meeting archangels and many other things. So thank you for being here, Gabriel.
Yeah, truly blessed to share and to be a part of this.
Yeah. So about 3 years ago, you decided to leave society and go out into the wilderness. What was your life like leading up until that moment? What were you feeling?
Yeah, so it was probably closer to 4 years ago. I've been out of solitude for about a year now. Like so many other beings, I was a seeker in life, but I didn't actually know what I was seeking for. I just knew the world didn't make sense to me, ever as a child, and I didn't understand why we couldn't all just get along and be peaceful, but I didn't really have a strong seeking for God necessarily, for unity or oneness or anything like that. I think I was just seeking for some sort of peace in the world, and have always been an explorer of consciousness, in whatever ways, reading books about psychology, psychonauting for a while, and then I got into ayahuasca about actually now looking back on it, probably about 7 or 8 years ago. And I had this period in my life where I sat with grandmother quite a few times. And on the third time I sat with her, I had this really profound vision where these two serpents came and they were working their way through my body, just going in my body, out of my body, working themselves over my body. It was this really profound vision. I was actually on the ground, like convulsing, and I knew that something was being taken out of my body, like an exorcism of a sort. I didn't quite understand what was happening. And when it was over, after about an hour, I tilted my head back, and I remember just breathing out for the longest period of time. And I realized that all the ways that I had adapted to the world, normalized to the world, had suddenly left my body, and it was really intense within the container of the beautiful spiritual environment of the ceremony. I was fine, but as soon as I left that ceremony, I'd always had some mild anxiety, but suddenly I just had the most profound anxiety. Nothing made sense in the world to me anymore. How we lived our lives, burning fossil fuels, using plastics, the way we treated each other, the money system, just everything, nothing. And I had been in society. I was a physician assistant. I mean, by any degree of the conditioned world, I was doing okay in the world. Successful, but suddenly that nothing made sense. Even in my job of medicine, I couldn't understand the fear around death anymore, it began this really profound period of a couple of years of anxiety where I just couldn't sit still. I literally couldn't sit still anywhere. I was just running crazy in the world. I ended up quitting my job, exiting a relationship, and eventually what started to transform within myself is I just realized that everything I was doing in the world was creating downstream karma. If I bought something, it was mined, it was produced, if I, every single action I took in the world was hurting someone, was what my thinking mind was thinking. And it began this period of, how do you live in this world this way? There was some profound, like, not wanting to kill myself necessarily, but how do you end the anxiety, and how do you not harm people by living in this karmic realm? And it eventually just dawned on me that to go move into solitude and to just live as simply as I could and to disconnect from the world was the way to do the least harm in the world. And that's what caused me to go into spiritual solitude. It wasn't a seeking, like I should go into spiritual solitude for the spiritual nature of it. It was a super anxiety ridden person thinking, how do I do the least harm in the world? And so that eventually I drove to the Moab desert. I didn't even know where I was going. I was just like driving endlessly, but I ended up driving to Moab, to this really beautiful spot. Stayed there for about 2 or 3 months. And maybe to speak of it in a moment, if it's called, but how I actually started believing in God was a really beautiful experience that happened in the Moab desert. And then subsequent from there, I ended up driving down to Sedona and realizing now God just guided me to the most beautiful spot that no one ever seemed to know about, that I could basically just stay in for 3 years. I'd come out every few weeks to get food, but mostly I would just stay there in the desert. It was exceptionally anxiety provoking. It wasn't peaceful at first which we'll talk about, but until I discovered inner child healing, which really began the inward journey of loving my heart.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when you went into solitude, did you think of it as, like, did you have a word for what you were doing, or a concept at all? Like, I am going into solitude, or I am doing this.
Yeah, just checking out of the world. I just couldn't figure out how to live in the world without creating harm. So how did I refer to it to people? I think I probably just would say I was checking. Everybody I knew realized how anxious I was in the world. I was pretty vocal about that. Nothing made sense, Not didn't make sense, but just that the way we lived our lives just wasn't in alignment with love and peace, So, but I think I probably just called it checking out of the world.
At the time, were you aware of yourself as an empath or a healer or anything along those lines?
I knew myself to be an empath because I felt the suffering of the world. There was no doubt about that. I didn't think of myself as a healer. I knew that I had some strengths that I could communicate with people, and when I was feeling well, and transmit kind of love in that way. But definitely didn't think of myself as a healer. Just.
So there was no grand vision. It was almost like just desperation.
It was desperate, but it was also, there was something, there was the sense that the greatest gift I could give to the world was to check out of it and not cause harm. You could think about taking all these actions or protesting or trying to do something, but it seemed to me that all those were in the world, and that the greatest way I could help heal the world was at that time, like, the UN was meeting and they're talking about the coyote tree, and things like that. And it just dawned on me, like, just stop. Just
Stop.
Park your car. Don't participate. Don't buy anything. Don't do anything. That was the greatest way we could bring peace and healing to the world and each other.
Okay, so then you get into the wilderness, you get into the desert, and the first, few months did your anxiety increase?
Oh, it was awful. It was beyond awful. I mean, my greatest fear was being alone. Looking back now and understanding it more, I was so codependent, and the idea of being alone was my worst nightmare. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but it
wasn't like you were like, yay!
It was so immensely anxiety provoking, and I wanted to disconnect from the world. At the very beginning, I would text somebody every now and then or check in. Months might go by and I wouldn't be in communication. But at the very beginning, occasionally I would communicate out, but mostly I would just simply sit there, and I didn't know how to deal with it. My mind was so anxious. I'd pace. There was never a moment of peace. But then through a gift of God, I started to discover inner child healing, specifically somebody named John Bradshaw, a book he wrote called Homecoming. And he was a brother who, I think he was an alcoholic who had gone through the 12-step program and then somehow within himself discovered inner child healing and was transmitting that kind of truth out to the world. But I didn't even really read his whole book. It was just, he started talking about using the inner voice to love the wounded inner child in your heart. And as soon as I started to do that, I started to use the inner voice to talk to my heart, to say, like, I'm here and I love you and we're in this together, and we're going to, as it immediately dawned that brought peace, you know? And I started to treat it like it wasn't the outer me that was anxious or fearful of being in solitude. I started to treat it like it was the wounded inner child in my heart that was fearful and anxious. And I started to use my inner voice as the perfect parent, later to discover it's the divine parent, but as the perfect parent to love my heart. So, you know, the anxiety's through the roof. And so I'd say to that wounded inner child who had the anxiety, you know, I'm here and I love you and I'm always going to be here for you. And the outer world doesn't make sense, but here's a place of peace and love, you know, and we're always going to be together. And as soon as I did that, the love, I mean, you know, as we're starting to realize, so many know now, bhakti, you know, there's a point in our heart that if we loves us back, you know, and
bhakti being devotion.
Yeah, devotion to God, but at the time to the inner child, in truth, the same. And well, to talk about that, the wounded inner child healed of all their conditioning is the divine child again, you know. So, but as soon as I mean, it was the only thing that would bring any relief in solitude. There was nothing else. So it became not even by a choice, it just became intuitive. I'm anxious. What am I going to do but comfort the child? So,
is there a particular book that you can recall by John Bradshaw?
Yeah, in particular, he has a book called Homecoming.
Homecoming.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll put that in the link.
Yeah.
I'll put a link in the description box to that. So,
yeah.
I mean, how blessed were you that came through to you to give you the solution?
I don't think I would have made it without it. I don't know how it would have happened otherwise. Yeah. And I just started to use the inner voice like that. It was constant. I mean, it was 24/7, waking up in the middle of the night, anxious, trying to get to sleep. I'd sing the inner child lullabies at night. You know, I'd help them go to sleep when they were anxious, when they woke up in the morning. And then after about 2 months of that, it was actively using my inner voice that way. There was the realization, starting as I started to love myself too, there was the realization that I didn't realize, you know, I guess we all kind of realize that we have an inner voice that's so critical of ourselves, you know, this fierce inner critical voice. But as I started to bring online this inner voice that loved me, it became immediately apparent how that inner voice of judgment and shame and doubt, that voice of our childhood conditioning, how much that causes the anxiety and the fear. And as I started to replace it with the voice of love, you know, I started to realize the power of that voice of love. And then after about 2 months, I remember clearly, like there was this moment of, I was walking through where I was camped, and there was this moment of profound anxiety in it. And I didn't actively start to comfort myself. Suddenly, just automatically, a voice arose and started to love and comfort me in the same way that I had been doing, but also with its own language and its own voice. And
did it have a different tone?
No, it was no tone. No, it was the same as my inner voice. It just started to take on it had its own capital M mind, if you would. It used a lot of the language I did, but it flowed with it. It started to grow and metamorphosize as its own. Just the same way that our inner voice of judgment, doubt, and shame has become so good on its own of keeping us anxiety provoked, and you know, this voice just started to take on its own power. And I wasn't very spiritual at the time, but immediately it became apparent to me that I had awoken the divine feminine, the divine mother in myself. This voice was the divine mother, and very soon it clicked that this wounded inner child, when it was healed, was going to be the divine child again.
Wow.
Yeah.
So as you started to feel that voice talk to you, automatically? Was it interspersed with still trying to make it happen, or was it just like something clicked and then it just became?
It clicked, but still, that it wasn't. There was still plenty of struggle, and that inner voice of adversity was still there. So there were times where it would come in on its own, and then there would be times where I'd be very anxiety provoked, and I'd actively bring the voice in.
We've talked in the past few weeks about this a lot, and I'd love for you to share a little bit more about this. So you've often said that you call it the inner adversarial voice, is the root basically of all suffering. And could you talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, anytime we feel any emotion, negative feeling, it's because there's this inner voice that's something, an external stimuli comes, something comes, and we have this inner voice that says this isn't okay, or if you're feeling bad, like you're always going to feel this way, or
it's like attacking.
It's constantly attacking, or it's bringing up this relationship that you were in that you're no longer in, or this thing you did and how you should have done it or could have done it another way. In truth, it's our conditioned voice, and we're born in unity and oneness with ourselves, not necessarily with an inner voice per se, the state of the unified self is unconditional love and unconditional belief in itself, and it's not till we start being conditioned, people start telling us not to be ourselves. You should do this way. You need to do this way. If you do, and we start becoming anxious, every time we're at peace, somebody says you should do something else, or you should be, and we start to develop this voice, and we're constantly like scanning everything to try to apply this conditioning, this conditioning, and that manifests as the thinking mind / inner voice that's constantly attack. It means well. It's actually, the inner voice, I call it adversarial, but it means well. It's trying to help us find peace through this conditioned world, but the only way it knows to seek for it is through the conditioned fears and anxieties of being itself that we're conditioned into it. And to speak also that that not to put the burden on the people who conditioned us necessarily.
Right.
I see it as past life karma being given to us as a young child. That's the role that our parents or other beings have in our life, is to give us that karma.
Yeah. Okay, so you're in the desert and you're alone, and then the voice has suddenly changed over into the Divine Mother, and the Divine Child is emerging. What happens next?
It started to become so incredibly visionary. All of a sudden, this, as I see it, the inner realm of consciousness, the inner realm of imagination, if you will, it's so filled with worry and fears and anxieties that it's taken away from this beautiful field of consciousness that can show us visions and can show us all kinds of higher truths. And what it's trying to do is, all these visions, is they're trying, duality, you hear that term, is that we're separated from ourself, from our highest self, by an inner adversarial voice that stands opposed to ourself. To me, that's duality. That's the state of duality. I mean, the whole world's in duality. We all think we're something other than we are, and it creates this state of anxiety and fear. But as we heal ourselves of all these egoic stories that divide us from ourselves, this conditioning, then what emerges in our consciousness are these beautiful visions, that are the unifying inner living myths that connect us back to ourselves. And that's
Okay.
and so I started to have these really, and many beings do. I think any beings who have ever been in solitude, as I read Thomas Merton and all these ancient sages, I mean, they all are living, and they're all experiencing constantly this inner mystical realm. I should say too that I started to do another part of John Bradshaw's techniques, and that was that I started to, once I realized the power of unconditional love, then I started to realize, I started to be able to look in my inner realm, and I started to really examine like what this conditioning was. And I started to realize that what that inner voice is that we're, this complex, but basically a stimuli will come in, whether it's a thought or something in the external realm will remind us of something. And we end up getting this like somatic trigger. Like if a car came around the corner, you might have like a kind of sensation. That's constantly how we're experiencing the world. And when those somatic sensations go off, so many of them are triggers that we're doing something wrong or something should be some other way. Then all of a sudden we disassociate, we go into a state of fight or flight. We disassociate for a moment, and then we all of a sudden we have this like flashback within our inner consciousness of a childhood wounding or something, leaving somebody in our life.
It's just like a split second.
It's a split second of disassociation, but you may be in that. You may relive a profound moment of, it could be a longer period of time within that consciousness. But then, so suddenly you're a child, in a difficult situation, and then suddenly you come back to this moment, and you quickly forget it instantly, like a dream, but you're left with the emotion of that child suck. So I started to really be looking in my inner realm, as I think most people in solitude do, what's actually going on in there. And I started to wonder, like, okay, sometimes I'm sort of okay, and then all of a sudden, boom, I feel awful. And what was the cause of that? When I looked, I was having these disassociated flashbacks to woundings, coming back to this moment, not realizing it was happening. But so I started to use those. Like I started to, if all of a sudden, one that was profound was I kept feeling the somatic sensation in my throat. And when I would examine it, when I started to see what that flashback was that was causing it, I was sitting on the top of my stairs in my home as a very young child, and my parents were fighting downstairs. So then I started to use the power of unconditional love. I would hold on to that seeing, if you will, and I would go as the divine mother to that child in that situation. I couldn't change externally what was happening to them. And what I'm describing is shadow work, essentially.
We actually do something similar in Reiki, where we go back to a traumatized memory, and then we send the energy back in time to literally heal the wound that moment created. So it's so necessary.
And so I would go to that child and I'd say, like, I'm here and I love you and you're not alone. We can't fix what's happening, but you don't have to worry. I'm here and there's peace and love in our heart, and I'm always going to be here for you. And it was so incredibly healing, both in that moment and in this moment. Later on, it started to transform. I'd gain the child's confidence. I'd take them in my arms and bring them back into the light in my heart. And I started to dissolve all these flashbacks, all these somatic sensations I'd transformed from triggering to a difficult situation to triggering to an environment of love and peace. But that going inward and doing that really started to illuminate the inner realm. The light of unconditional love is truly what eliminates our inner realm. Our inner realm used to be such a vivid place of imagination. We used to plan it all the time. But as it got filled with the anxiety and the worry, it started to become dark. The light went out of it, And
so you basically became a child again.
In truth, ultimately, that's what we're doing. To be in oneness with ourselves is to so utterly trust in creation that you're not thinking about the present or the past. You're not comparing the present moment to the past or the future to try to apply these conditioned responses. I mean, Jesus talks about it in the Bible. So many people talk about having a child's mind as being the last step to going into unity. You're just utterly at peace as yourself. You trust in creation as it is. Greater truths about how this is all coming into being and that we're not the mind body, and thus you're just a child's mind with love in your heart. You just simply are yourself. It's the easiest possible way to be.
So you were healing, you were becoming a child again, you were filled with wonder, and then you had a vision.
Yeah, so the vision was really profound. I had been in solitude for about a year and a half. The inner child healing was really powerful. It was still something that, again, sometimes it was automatic. Sometimes I had to do it. There was still a lot of struggle, but at least I knew how to work with it, and heal it. But my mind was growing a lot quieter. It wasn't filled with the worry. I was in a state in solitude where I hadn't really read. I mean, I guess I had read the Bhagavad Gita, but I didn't really understand what it was talking about so much. But I was just getting into this state of being where the thinking mind wasn't online very much, and I couldn't even tell that I was having difficulty finding the I. Like when I'd walk across the desert or something like that, it's as strange as it sounds, I couldn't really say that I was doing it. I would start to just say walking or something, like consider that I was walking. Not I was walking, just walking,
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that just for some reason really profoundly on this day. But I was lying down, just meditating, just eyes closed, just quieting my mind. And I was actually singing a Hebrew prayer, the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, blessed be his glorious kingdom forever and ever. And I was chanting it almost and feeling the vibrations, just being one with the vibrations. And all of a sudden I had such a blessed vision. I was ripped out of my body. My hands went out to the side. I felt like I was being ripped out of my body. A voice came and said, "You have healed your karma from Alpha to Omega." And I started to ascend up. I was very lucid. Like it was almost like being here now. Everything was so clear. I passed by what I knew to be these other two heavens, which I later came to know as the 8th and 9th heaven, but then suddenly found myself in the 10th heaven, standing before this enormous archangel, probably hard to know how big I was, but like relative to my body size, like 50 feet, just huge, as clear as day, beautiful, holding this circular disc that had all these like myriad of colors within it, and who introduced themselves as Archangel Metatron, who I really hadn't heard of. It wasn't something that I had some depth of experience with, but introduced themselves as Archangel Metatron and began this conversation, just like as we're sitting here talking, that started to show me around heaven. I was in this vast space. I could see what was called the light universe, it's like the universe from outside looking inside at it. I could see the light of God, like above heaven, shining down. I could see how out of this light universe came the light that comes down through our crown into our heart, down below in these lower karmic realms. I could see when the thinking mind was active, these whirlpools of thoughts that would encase the light, that the light was coming down through. And Archangel Metatron started to show me how creation comes into being in the present moment outside of time. And also, and this is the key, and if you read the Bible or so many other texts, it's so important that we all know this, why there's struggle in this realm, Otherwise, this just seems like a crazy place. But what was shown to me is that even the struggle's divine love from God, from the Creator, and because the struggle is what compels us to go inward to our heart, to restore the unconditional love, to find our way back home to God. If it hadn't been for all the struggle in life, for all the difficulties, I would have been stuck in the karmic realm forever. And I'll get back to the vision in a second, but when I came back from the vision, that was hard to take, that God loved us so much that he gave us struggle. I didn't quite it took me a couple weeks in truth to process that. But it's so incredibly true when you see struggle that way in this realm, when you understand that the struggle is divine love, that often puts us on our knees with suffering, but compels us to go inward to our heart and love ourselves. Then you start to realize that the struggle is just an opportunity to learn to love yourself, and the struggle doesn't seem like struggle anymore. I was shown so much. I was given words to take back with me to learn about when I came back. One in particular was something called the Omega Point, which was what that disc that Archangel Metatron had that transformed the light of God through the law of karma into this creation that we're in. I was shown how the light comes down through the ninth heaven, which is divine wisdom, the Akashic, and how the story is put into play, the experience, you will, like we're experiencing right now, the experience that can either gently guide us on the path, like we're hopefully doing now, and give us these truths, or else the story that might include struggle and suffering that will compel us to go inward to our heart. I saw how the light continues to come down through the eighth heaven, the realm of pure form. It's the realm of our ancestors. Like when we die and we ascend to the first heaven, the eighth heaven, where we meet our ancestors. Everything, a tree, a chair, a person, everything is in pure form. The karma hasn't been applied to it. We're not applying the thinking mind thoughts about what it should be. And to speak that the eighth, ninth, and 10th heaven, they're chakra realms. The 7 chakra realms, or the 6 chakra realms in our body, the crown that divides it, and then the 8th, ninth, and 10th chakra realm. Although in truth, we access, you get to the heavenly realms by opening the heart chakra. That opens the portal, and then you ascend through the crown to the heavenly chakra realms.
Could you say more about karma and the law of karma and how that works? Because my life is composed of also a lot of solitude, being alone, meditating, loving myself, doing practices, and then also meeting with other fellow healers and people on the spiritual path. And I think that one of the reasons I wanted to do this interview with you is because you were truly the first person that I got to know in a very close way, where you showed me what's actually beyond because a lot of us were talking about the new earth, we're creating the new earth, we're creating a heavenly realm on earth, and I feel it happening. We're gathering together and we're literally raising the vibration of this planet really fast right now, right? And there's a real sense that we have when we come together in these groups and these blessed gatherings of like, whoa, things are really changing now. Like we're literally in the heavenly realms, like while on earth. And yet I've observed in myself and then other beings, fellow healers, star seeds, light workers, that we still encounter a good bit of suffering on a daily basis. Maybe it's not our own, but maybe we just feel the suffering of others and it's constantly breaking our heart. So in our getting to know each other, you actually started showing me like how to move beyond that. You were the first person. It really clicked for me. And you were talking about the law of karma and how it relates to thought. So could you kind of walk us through, for the healers and the fellow light workers and star seeds who are like, okay, I'm usually really happy, but then like the vaccine and then my loved one dies, or it's like these like lingering like traumas that keep coming up, and we're kind of just, so how do we transcend suffering? How do we get
so to understand what the law of karma is, it's whether we're in alignment or resistance to our capital S self. Creation's not broken. We may see things happening in the world and we don't want them to be that way. We get sick, old age, our loved ones die, there's craziness in the world, wars, there's fighting, those kinds of things. The state of being ourself in oneness with God, our highest healed unified self, which is consciousness itself, is utter detachment from opinions and preferences. And that's hard. I mean, that's hard to, because those are thinking mind thoughts, this should be this way or this should be that way, creation seems broken to us, but it's really, we're being given the experiences that we're meant to have, that are either going to gently guide us on the path or compel us to go inward to our heart to love ourselves, and and to say too that as we detach from our preferences to the world, as we learn to trust the Lord of creation, if you will, the creative force of consciousness, embodied in our heart, as we learn to trust the forces that bring into being this experience that we're experiencing, it doesn't mean an action to not have thinking thoughts, to not be in judgment. If you think like this, people shouldn't treat each other, you're probably right. It's letting go utterly of the worry and the fears and the anxieties and the thinking it should be that way, being at peace and allowing our higher self to create in accordance with goodness,
So you're saying that action may still happen from you because you have goodness in your heart, and that just will naturally happen, but you do it without anxiety?
Exactly. And we see it so much, like playing a musical instrument or something. If you're trying to think all the time, oh, I should have done this, oh, you're not doing this right, we don't play beautiful music, but when we let go, it's not even like we're doing it, it's just coming through us. And that's the state of being in oneness with ourself. The thinking mind is an overlay that we put on top. This shouldn't be this way, this should be some other way. But when we let go of that, then we're simply at peace. We may still stand up to get between, somebody's doing something awful. We may get up and put ourselves there, or we may speak before a crowd and say, but it's not through thinking thought that we're doing that. It's not through fear and anxiety. We're learning to play the musical instrument, if you will, of the self by letting go of those fears and anxieties. In truth, even people who are very who are activists in this world, at times they take action, and at other times they're just sitting there, and it's about not having the fears and anxieties while we're sitting here thinking creation's broken, it needs to be this way. It's about just loving and trusting. At first it's loving the wounded inner child, but once the inner child's healed and you discover the greater truth about yourself as consciousness, then it's just trusting and believing in consciousness that it knows what it's doing, and that we can just relax and be at peace,
That's good. Yeah, we were yesterday just meeting with our friend who was saying that one of her family members was critiquing her because she was relaxing and letting go and trusting in the universe. And he was saying, well, if you do that, then basically you're just going to be a bad person, because he didn't have that trust. And so I appreciate what you're saying for people, because I think that is a common fear of if I just trust what's going on, then I think it's in, a lot of us who have religious conditioning, we're taught at a young age that we have original sin, or we're born a sinner, we're born bad. So to flip that and be actually, no, you are goodness. That is your real state. And let that shine through trusting the universe and not constantly trying to manipulate or control everything with the thinking mind.
It puts us in this state of fear and anxiety, and thus our consciousness is filled with fear and anxiety, and thus the creation that takes place within consciousness is, if we want to heal this realm, it's about there's a greater truth about that, is that creation's not taking place through linear time as we're experiencing it through the thinking mind. It's experiences that are arising in the present moment into being, built off of the experiences that came before it that are in our consciousness, like if we had multiple dreams in a night, we're trying to tell a story that connects every dream, but it's just experiences with a child's mind that is arising in the present moment. And if we want to see creation transform into a realm of pure goodness, pure light, pure love, then the idea is, how do we not be anxious all the time? How do we not be fearful? And in truth, it's about learning to love ourself, which is which is consciousness, and that's our highest self, and then our higher self being the creative force of consciousness. It's learning to love and trust in those, and learning why there's struggle so that we can love the struggle and love everyone, love everything in this realm. That truly puts us in a state of peace. Thus our consciousness is in peace. Thus the creation that comes into being is going to be filled with light and love.
So how do you perceive what's going on in the world right now in terms of this new earth that everyone is talking about? How do we, are you saying that our consciousness is literally manifesting that new earth, or are you saying each one of us adds to it? Because I know you've said sometimes that we're each our own little universe. How does it work? Like, what do I do? Is it my universe that I'm manifesting, or is it just happening already? Or
yeah, so there's only one consciousness. We're not a mind body experiencing this world around us through our consciousness. We are, and not the mind body, but our true being is consciousness itself, in which this experience of being a mind body and all that's happening around us is coming into being. Is when we, it's they talk about the I. You speak about the I am presence or something like that. It's that the I that we're always referring to, whether we're in a dreaming we're a dolphin, or whether we're, in this experience here, the I that we're always referring back to is consciousness. If I were to have a dream that I was a dolphin jumping through the water, doing all those kinds of things, when I woke up, I would say, oh, well, I jumped through the water, I came out, I splashed around. If I was an alien in a dream, I'd say, oh, I flew my spaceship here and I went to these planets. And now I'm back in this experience, and I say, oh, I'm sitting on the couch talking to Anya Light, and having a beautiful conversation. The I that we're referring to, and that we think it's the mind body, because that voice of judgment that's constantly there makes us think, and we can talk more about that we're this mind body. But when that goes offline, you start to realize, you start to transcend the mind body, and you start to realize yourself as consciousness. You are consciousness. This experience comes into being, then a dream comes into being of being a dolphin, then a dream of an alien comes into being, and then back to this waking life. You always remain as consciousness, and the experience, that's the unchanging field of God. That's the unchangingness of God, and the emptiness of unknowing, as the Buddhists call it, in which all these experiences are arising and falling.
Or in yoga, they call it the self.
Yeah, the self. I mean, it is. It's ultimately our self is consciousness itself. And remind me of your question now.
It's basically like, okay, so I'll rephrase it. So we are entering this period on the planet with intense change, everyone's waking up. Not everyone, but I mean, so many more than it used to be in the past. So many people waking up. It's like a flood of light on this planet. We met in a magical fairyland where, this beautiful place in Colorado where, everyone mostly is free from a lot of conditioning. They free themselves, people dancing in the streets. And it's just, so we met in that space, and that space came into being, as you've said, as a result of the work that we each did for ourselves to get us to the point where we could absorb that. But does a place like that exist outside of us? Like, does it just exist, or is it that each of us step into that reality separately? Or does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense.
Okay.
It's as our consciousness ascends, as we heal ourselves of that adversarial voice and transform into that voice of unconditional love and start transcending the mind body, then we're not in this constant judgment of creation. We're not saying this is wrong, this is right, this should be this way, this shouldn't be that way. Thus, we're not filling the consciousness with this is wrong, this is wrong. We're filling it with beauty and love and acceptance and unity and things. And And thus the creation that takes place is in accordance with
Mm.
with that. When we're here in this beautiful, blessed environment as we are right now, where it's that our consciousness is clear and it's healed, and thus the creation that's coming into being is in accordance with light. But again, the whole I am, the fact that there's only one I. Like the I, when you say I do this and I say I do, we're actually referring to the consciousness, and everybody is the same I, although we see it through our individual lens of our conditioning and where we are on the path. It's like we're in the state of duality, we're separated from ourselves, looking back at ourselves through that whirlwind of thinking, if you will, of our conditioning and thoughts. And the more that we clear that out, the more that we see the beauty, in the world, and thus what comes into creation is in accordance with that beauty and light.
Mm. So you had this vision of Metatron in the wilderness, and then integrated that into your being, and then so then how did you end up here? How did you end up back in the world and driving a car sometimes? And
it's interesting. It's kind of just started to happen on its own. It wasn't a decision like I should leave solitude or I should. It just started to happen, as we start to get rid of judgment. For a long time, this is what I was. I was checked out of the world because of all the craziness that was going on, but that was a label I was placing on myself. That was almost a dogma of its own kind, of saying this is who I am and this is what I'm doing and this defines my being. But as the judgment started to go offline, it wasn't that the thinking mind was deciding what I should be doing. I was just what the mind body does takes place on its own and not through the thinking mind. And I found myself just being guided to what seemed to very like to spread the word of what I had learned, to share the truth of unconditional love for ourselves, and so it just began this gradual process of leaving solitude more and more. It was incredible. I was truly just, with every breath, just breathing out back into the oneness. My mind was so blessed and clear, and it would be like without thinking, my body would just get up and drive in a car, and I wouldn't know if I was going left or right. I wouldn't know. I would just simply go where I was meant to go, and I would arrive at some being or some group of being or some experience, either like what we experienced in Colorado, where people are playing music and it's just this blessed experience, or to somebody who is really down and out in some way, and I would just speak the words from my heart, and they were the words that were meant to be spoken. It's just utter trust and belief in our highest self that we can utterly surrender and allow consciousness to create in the way that it does. And that's the law of karma. We were in resistance to ourselves so long that all we saw is chaos and ugliness in some way, interspersed with beautiful light, but shadows and light. But when you let go of thinking, you just start to see it's so obvious. It's so, in the Bible, just to use one sacred text, the Lord of creation, the creative force of consciousness, is constantly saying, like, just love me, have that relationship like you did with me when you were a little child. Love the Lord God in your heart. When Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment is, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. That was the number one commandment. And when we do that, we let go of judgment, and thus the law of karma swings to alignment as opposed to resistance. And it's so obvious, like the force of gravity. It's a force of the universe. When you throw a ball, you don't think about it, but you arc it up because it's gonna come down. Likewise, why wouldn't you be in alignment with yourself and trusting because the creation that takes place is just miracles, just pure miracles. Yeah.
Reminds me of the day we were sitting on the beach in Kansas. We were camping, and maybe 10 geese came over, and I love geese. They're my favorite, animal. Well, one of them. And I was in such bliss feeding them. And then like I just was like, my heart was going to explode and it couldn't get any better. And then literally, like, I had this, I think, I forget exactly, but I thought I said something to you like, this is the most blissful. And then literally you were like, oh, and look. And then you pointed and there was like 20 more geese coming, like all in a big pack. So it was like descending upon the beach. And I was like, ah! It was like even more bliss. Like, and that's, you know, this time that we have spent together thus far, it's like miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle, to the point where it's almost just becomes normal. It's like, oh, this is how life is now. Like, not to take it for granted, but just to realize that this is how creation works, you know?
It is. And also to realize, because it is still the karmic realm, you know, there is still, you know, there's a lot of suffering going, but a couple things with that. One is, you're absolutely right. I mean, once we are in alignment with ourselves, the miracles, the light that we see, you know, it's ever present, and it's so obvious that it doesn't make sense to be the other way. But also to say, you know, because people worry about spiritual bypassing and things like that too, is you still are aware of the struggle and the suffering in the world. You're still aware. You haven't turned a blind eye to it. It's just that you're at peace and you trust creation, and that's when opportunities arise to spread healing or help people find their way back, or to lend a hand or give somebody your coat, you know, or something like that. Like, you're still doing that. You're just not in a state of fear and anxiety. And also, struggle may still, what we used to call struggle, may still arise in our life, like the air conditioning not working in the car on very hot days on the way back. In fact, the heater being stuck on full, but like, but you don't see it as struggle anymore. It's not struggle. It's just an opportunity to deepen your love for God. So there's miracles like that, but it's not like the struggle can, you know, it's still the karmic realm. This is still, you know, and it's still a realm where it's trying to heal everyone and all beings back into unity and oneness, you know, so that we can transcend the good versus evil and just be in the realm of the heavenly realm of goodness, you know. It's just a different relationship, you know. You understand why there's struggle, and understanding why there's struggle in this realm, and that it's still divine love from God, even though it seems so incredibly awful, you know. That's literally the key to transcending the struggle and suffering forever.
So saying, I'm grateful, like in the midst of struggle, in the midst of pain, to say, I'm grateful for this. This really hurts, and I acknowledge that, and I'm here for you, inner child, and also, God, I am grateful because I know the divine plan.
Always, when struggle arises, first words that come into my mouth are, thank you, Lord, for this struggle, which is going to compel me to go inward and love myself, you know, love myself even more, which is how we heal out of that duality with that adversarial inner voice that keeps us separated, and into unity with that voice that unconditionally loves and believes in ourselves. I want to speak to just a quick segue, but it's not just unconditional love, it's unconditional belief in ourselves. After I started to transform that voice through inner child healing into loving myself, and that voice started to become more and more automatic on its own loving, there was still, I would be in blissful states, even in solitude, where before it was so anxiety provoking, but just bliss, just sitting there watching. I didn't have to do anything. Nature was doing everything, you know. Birds would fly by, bugs on the ground that you didn't, you know, it was just bliss. But still, struggle would sometimes arise. And when I started to go inward and analyze what's actually going on in there, I realized that there was a voice from above, the shadow of the Divine Father, that this isn't going to last. This isn't going to work. You know, this isn't going to... Doubting. Yeah, exactly. Doubt. That's the shadow of the Divine Father. And I started to have these other visions, these really profound, beautiful visions about Jesus's father, Joseph, you know, and his relationship to Jesus, and Pharaoh Akhenaten and his relationship to Tutankhamun, oddly enough, with such beautiful scenes, and the way that a divine father would speak to a son. And I started to automatically actively use my inner voice to say words like, trust in yourself like I trust in you, or even just trust yourself, or I believe in you, you know, and words like, someday you're going to inherit the kingdom, and I raise you to be yourself, trust in yourself, you have within yourself what it takes, and so eventually through actively saying those words, that voice of doubt transforms into the voice of unconditional belief in myself. And then to continue on this stream for just 1 second too, the unconditional love and the unconditional belief were always there. I started to get into this thing. It had to do with this book called the Philokalos. We've talked about it before, but this beautiful text of these, it was around 2,000 years ago, these Orthodox Christians who would go into the desert in Egypt in solitude for their life for 25 or 50 years. And they would write out these transmissions to other people who were going to do it about how to do it. And every single one of them talked about inward prayer to the heart. They had their own way of doing it, but they were essentially doing what I was doing. I didn't know about it at the time, but by giving love to their heart, inward prayer, that was really the key of what they were saying. But they kept talking about that it was important that you prayed unceasingly, and it became this almost koan of how do you pray unceasingly. And I recognized the importance of this, and I started to kind of analyze how does the unconditional love for myself be constant? There are times I'm not doing it. There are times it's not happening. How do you make it constant? And one of the saints in that book said, "Look under the trap door of your mind." So it's something else we can talk about perhaps, but Kundalini had become active. So I started to use Kundalini to look around. What does that actually mean? And I started to examine, and it dawned on me that before we had language, we had love and belief in ourselves, beyond even thinking we could be some other way. It wasn't even love and belief in ourselves. It was not knowing that we could doubt or not love ourselves, And so then I started to experiment with when you actually look at the inner voice, I mean, what is that? Are we actually talking to ourselves? What actually is happening there, And I started to realize it's more of an energy transmission. So then I started to experiment with, is there some sort of light language I can talk to myself? And started to experiment with what light language was. And then I started to realize that I could just sort of, from the Divine Mother's perspective, look at the child with like a knowing love that everything's okay and peaceful, just be at peace. And I started to do that. And as I started to do that, specifically what I just spoke about, it all of a sudden just clicked. When the child's bathed and immersed in constant unconditional love and constant unconditional belief in itself, eventually its fears and anxieties dissipate and go away. Mm-hmm. It suddenly is. It's not even a lover and the loved. It's just love. It's not, it's not the believer and the believed. It's just belief. And then the voices go away, and you are love. You are belief, and that's when we start to unify in oneness with
I love that. So we already are what we seek.
100%.
Right now.
We are consciousness having this experience. The question is, how do we transcend thinking we're the mind body that's so fearful, constantly trying to apply all this conditioning that it was told is critical, at the fear of punishment, at the fear of it's going to get hurt, and how do we transform back to unconditional trust in the creative force that's bringing into being this experience?
I think you've given us some great tools to work with today. To start to close our beautiful conversation, is there anything else in your heart that you feel that someone might need to hear right now?
Just the whole idea is that to become unattached from this realm through the thinking mind, and that's a really fearful thing to do, to turn our entire lives over to creation that's bringing this into being. That meditation is such a key part of it. Like mindfulness meditation is such a key part of this. Is just start doing little activities like cut vegetables or brushing your teeth or something like that. Start to see that the thinking mind's not the one that's actually doing that. It might be judging you. You should get your molars, and why don't you floss, and all this kind of thing. But to just start getting used to the idea that the thinking mind's not actually doing everything. you know, to just watch that, to mindfulness meditation as you cut vegetables. Realize you're not thinking about how to hold the knife and how to balance it and how exactly. You might have a judgment, you cut that too thin, but it's just sort of happening on its own. There's such an incredible peace and then you just build up to greater and greater experiences in your life of that surrendering yourself to the consciousness that brings everything into creation. When we can, when things seem complex and difficult, when we can just surrender and turn it over to the creative force that's bringing into creation and just rest in peace with love in our heart, that's truly where the peace of God starts to shine forth.
Yeah. Wow. Gabriel, thank you so much. I love you so much. I'm so grateful for you to be here in Anya's ashram today to share with everyone, and just may your journey continue to be blessed and just deepen, and may all your dreams and wishes come true as well.
I'm blessed, and love to everyone, and may all beings awaken to the peace and the love that's already present in their heart. May we all be liberated from our suffering, and may we all clear our thinking mind and love each other and ourself, which in truth is one, so that creation can take place in accordance with the goodness of God as opposed to the karmic creation of goodness versus evil.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time.